Kia ora and good evening. Thank you so much for tuning into tonight's webinar. My name is Sarah Coolins, and I'm the Education and Outreach Manager at Sir Peter Blake Merck, the Sir Peter Blake Marine Education and Recreation Center, and that's where I lead the coordination of Seaweek. Tonight's webinar is going to be about exploring marine ecosystems, their diversity, and the significance of marine protection. Joining me virtually, we have 3 guest speakers who will be sharing their knowledge and their areas of expertise. I'm just going to launch a really quick poll before introductions and while we have some more people join us. The polls are going to pop up on your screen and then you're just going to hit submit. Oops, let's see if I can get the right one. And I'm going to just tell you a bit more about Seaweek and New Zealand's annual celebration of the sea. If you guys let us know where you're tuning in from, you can introduce yourself in the chat. And I'll just tell you a little bit about Seaweek at the moment, and then I'll end the poll and we'll get started and I'll introduce our speakers. So Seaweek's mission is to excite and inspire everyone to renew their connections with the sea. Our pinnacle of events occurs annually at the beginning of March, and we try and support the coordination of activities throughout the country. Where I work is at Sir Peter Blake Merck, is at the edge of the Long Bay Okura Marine Reserve, and our mission is to provide safe, fun, high-quality marine environmental education and recreation experiences for young New Zealanders. The Merck team and I have a really deep appreciation of marine protected areas, partly because we're located right at the edge of the reserve. And we get to bring all of the students and people that visit into this incredible marine environment. And it's all thanks to the vision of Merck's founders to preserve a typical slice of the Hauraki Gulf. So we organize these virtual engagements as well as many in-person activities for the public year-round to create an opportunity for everyone to learn something new about our ocean, gain insight into the marine environment and recent research, and ask questions. Seaweek is endorsed as an Ocean Decade activity, and we are hosting the Ngā Kōrero webinar series thanks to support from the New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO. Okay, we're going to have a look at the poll results. I think we've got a bunch of you have participated. Thank you for tuning in from all different parts of the country. And it seems like we've got lots of people interested in learning about the marine ecosystem of the Hauraki Gulf and all of the above. So everyone's interested in this. And how did you find out about this webinar? Thanks for letting us know. So we're gonna move on to introducing our speakers in a moment. And we're gonna start off tonight by learning about Antarctica. And then we'll make our way north from there. I'm going to give you a brief overview of who's speaking, and then we'll launch into it. So our first guest speaker will be Svenja Halfter, who is a zooplankton ecologist and biochemist at NIWA. Svenja, her research focuses on the role of zooplankton in the marine ecosystem and carbon cycle. Tonight's second presentation will be by Mr. Richard Kinsey, Dock Senior Ranger based in Te Anau. He's a scientific diver, marine ecologist, and part of the Fiordland Marine Guardians team. Our final speaker will be Dr. Nick Shears, specialist in rocky reef ecology and marine conservation, associate professor and deputy head of research at University of Auckland. You can send us your questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We're going to take one question after each speaker is presented, and we'll try and take the rest of the questions at the end. And the Southern Ocean is captivating, and Svenja's research is first, and we're going to learn about it. It centers around using zooplankton as an indicator. Svenja's research centers around using zooplankton as an indicator of ecosystem changes and the effectiveness of the MPA. Without further ado, let me hand things over to you, Svenja.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Here we go. Awesome. Yeah, I'm very excited to be here today. Let's see if that's actually working. It was working before. Of course it's now. Oh, here we go. Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. Talk about the Ross Sea, my favorite topic, really. and Antarctica. And I'm based here in Te Whanganui-a-Tara, working for NIWA. But I'm also involved in an Arctic Science Platform, and I get some funding and support by a philanthropic funder called Max3, and I get a lot of logistical support to go down south from Antarctic New Zealand. So all these organizations are really important for my work. Without them, I wouldn't even be here. So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me today. Here's some nice pictures from Antarctica. You will see more of them later. But I thought, yeah, it's a beautiful place to work. But yeah, here we go. Where it is it? Of course, you know where Antarctica is. Just drive south, and in the end, you end up in the Ross Sea. The Ross Sea is this little bit in the red piece of cake, basically. It's called the Ross Dependency, so it's a New Zealand Antarctic claim. And let's go on a bit of a touristy trip around. So we have the Ross Ice Shelf, which is kind of double the size of New Zealand. And I was quite lucky in the last season to sail along it, and it's quite big actually. It looks small on the map, but it's quite big. At the Northern Victoria land coast, so there's a lot of research going on there as well, and I've been there twice now with the ship mainly. But we do a lot of research down there because there's quite shallow habitats we're interested in. And then of course I've been to Scott Bay twice now as well. It's the green building, and of course this is not everything, but you know, their whole base is bigger than this. But there's Scott Bay, and it's based and it's located on Ross Island. And here you can also see Mount Erebus, the southernmost volcano on the planet. So it's a very special place, and I'm so lucky to work there. But how do you get to the Ross Sea? I kind of mentioned it already, but here you could use the ship. And these are the two ships I've been using before. So on the left, you can see the New Zealand ship RV Tangaroa. And I've been there, you know, used it in 2023 in summer. And this summer, last summer, just came back basically earlier this year. I went on the Italian icebreaker, the Laura Bassi, and it's an icebreaker, so we could actually go even further into the Ross Sea, which is amazing. Or you take the airplane, and there's usually the US Air Force or Kiwi planes that takes you down there, kind of between 5 to 8 hours, depending on the weather and how slow the plane is. And I've been lucky to take it a few times now, twice, and I will go again in October, so I'm quite excited and busy currently preparing the next field season. So here we go. Why is the Ross Sea important? Of course, there's a lot of cute little penguins and seals, but it's also a quite unique ecosystem. So there's a lot of benthics or seafloor habitats we're interested in. But and of course, all the cute little penguins and seals and whales. For example, there's 30% of all global Adelie penguins live down there. 50% of all Weddell seals, that's the one up in the corner, like snuggling up on the sea ice. And also, it is one of the least impacted ecosystem on the planet. Saying that, of course, there's human impacts there, but compared to other ecosystems, it's quite less impacted. However, talking about human impact, what are those? Because we go still down south and we still see impacts by humans. For example, tourism. Here's a tourism ship I saw on the last voyage down south. We did some research and they got battled in the storm, really. I'm not sure if they really enjoyed that trip, but yeah, I guess the views are still nice inside. So tourism compared to the Western Arctic, the Western Arctic Peninsula mainly, there's definitely less tourism in the Ross Sea, but it's still an impact factor. Then there's the toothfish fishery, so Antarctic toothfish, fish with long lines, and now we have the marine protected area, so it's there's less toothfish fisheries down there, but certainly an impact factor. There's plastic pollution, and of course you think, oh, it's quite far away and it's very pristine, but and I won't focus too much on this in this talk, but there we can see that there are marine plastic pollution coming into the Ross Sea, mainly with the currents, the water currents from the Southern Ocean. And of course, a big thing is climate change, and I mean we're already focusing on working on understanding the impacts of climate change in the Ross Sea. So if you look at all of these impact factors, it's kind of hard to manage plastic pollution directly in the Ross Sea because, you know, we can't stop the ocean currents. We can't directly stop climate change in the Ross Sea either. We could stop it elsewhere by reducing emissions, for example. But it's hard to do in the Ross Sea. But what we can actually manage is the fisheries, so and tourism as well. Not focusing on that either, but the fisheries mainly. So to do that, in 2017, they decided. Well, in 2016 they decided and entered into the force. In 2017, the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area, and the different zones of the MPA. Here, for example, in the zone, there's the krill research zone, and as it says, you're allowed to fish for krill there. Krills are like a small crustacean that's quite important for feeding whales and penguins and fish. So if people would be interested in krill, they would be able to fish there for, you know, to try out for commercial fishing. We're as scientists, we get permits and we're allowed to fish everywhere, if we have a permit, of course. And then, of course, there's the toothfish fishery. You can still do research on it in the special research zone, but the rest of the Ross Sea, so designed as a general protection zone, it's kind of a limit on fishery on there. So you can't just go in there and fish for unlucky toothfish. But the problem with the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area is that it expires. So it's just set now, 2017. And it will expire, though, after 35 years. And then there's a consensus needed from the international community to continue the MPA. So that sounds like a long time, but still, when you think about it, there might be fisheries coming into that region, which is, well, looks quite harsh, but it's also quite fragile in terms of ecosystem. You still, well, I wouldn't say worry, but you'd still want to make sure that the marine protected area is still necessary and useful. So to do this, to understand if the marine protected area is working and it's effective, I use my zooplankton because I'm a zooplankton person. But let's talk about zooplankton because you might not have heard that term before, which is all right. Zoo means animal. So when you walk to the zoo, you look at a lot of different animals, and plankton comes from the Greek and means drifter and wanderer. So zooplankton is kind of everything that drifts passively with the water currents. So tiny crustaceans, you need a microscope to look at, to large jellyfish that just drifting with the water currents. These are all zooplankton, which means it's a quite diverse group of animals and quite a lot of different species. And I don't know all of them, but I understand, well, I want to research more like different functions in the ecosystem. So I look at all the different communities and try to understand what they're doing, how they're changing, things like that. So that's my daily work, basically. And here are some nice pictures because you might not know how they look like. And we have, for example, here some sea snails and some amphipods, that type of crustaceans, and krill, as I mentioned before. This is how they look like, big eyes and a lot of legs. The crustaceans have too many legs anyway. And then we have copepods and little jellyfish and more jellyfish and little sea snails again. And salps, this kind of looks a bit like a jellyfish, but it's a bit more closer related to us than to actual jellyfish, which are a bit more ancient, taxa. So they're really pretty. Some of them don't look that pretty and they're really, transparent, but I picked some pretty ones. But why would you even study those? Because they're pretty, as I mentioned before. And if you're not convinced, obviously, take another look. Yeah, okay, here we go, convinced. But also they're quite important for the marine food web. Here's a graphic I have from my colleagues. And you can see here it's quite complicated, but I marked zooplankton and also krill, the both big groups I study, in orange. And you can see here by feeding on this little algae, so little plants swimming in the ocean, and they transport all this energy from the algae up to the higher food web. So like fish, for example, and toothfish, whales and seals and penguins and all the flying birds around Antarctica. So they're actually quite important, connecting the lower trophic levels, the algae, with everything we like to see in the ecosystem. And also, as mentioned in the introduction, we can use them as indicators of climate change. What does it actually mean? Because it sounds like a bit abstract, and it is, but it will be all right. Don't worry. Here, for example, we take pteropods. So pteropods, ptero means wing, and pod means foot. So wing foots, little sea snails, they have these little houses. And I brought you a video here, and I hope that's also now playing. Yeah, here we go. This is how they look like. And they're basically like snails on land, but instead of a foot to like, just scroll along the surface quite slowly, they have these two wings and they, fly through the water. They're actually quite cute. And as you can see also, I like snails because they're snails. They have this house and they produce shells. They're made of calcium carbonate. So that's a component. And the problem with that is that they're quite sensitive to ocean acidification. Here we go, another big word, but that's okay. Don't worry, there's a quick introduction to chemistry, but I'll make it very brief. Because as you're probably aware, is that there are more carbon dioxide now in the atmosphere because we're burning fossil fuels, for example. And here you can see a curve from this very famous observatory on Mauna Loa in Hawaii, saying that there's more and more carbon dioxide now in the atmosphere. The problem is then that the ocean takes up this carbon dioxide, not everything, but some of it, a big part of it, which lowers then the pH. The pH just means acidity. So the ocean basically is more sour. You can't quite taste that. You can try, but don't drink the whole ocean, please, because I need some water for my zooplankton. But the problem is with that sea snails, because they form these shells, they are really struggling with the lower pH because they need more energy then to form these shells. So as you can see, this is just like exposing the shells to a lower pH, but when they form these shells, they struggle quite a bit. And so we could use that because they're quite sensitive to that ocean acidification to see, if the community changes towards less pteropods, it might be an indicator for sour water, low pH in the water. So this is how we do it. And obviously, pteropods is just one example. Because, as I said, there's so many different diverse zooplankton out there. You just have to pick one. And if you understand the relationship to environment, you can just understand climate change impacts on the ecosystem. So fairly simple in the end. However, of course, there's a lot of work behind. Because how do we study zooplankton in the water? Maybe we can use satellites. So for little algae in the water, as you can see, they form these big blooms and we can see them even from space with satellites. But zooplankton, we can't really see them with satellites. There are some studies trying to do that when they're like really densely, like close to each other, but usually we can't really see them from space. Or, if you would study seals, you would attach these little instruments and then you can see where the seal would go and swim and where they would feed and everything, but zooplankton is a bit too small and too fragile for that. So we can't do that really either. And what I do is just a list, and it's not everything, all the methods that are out there, but these are just the methods I use. We have this tool called Continuous Plankton Recorder. So it's basically a box we towed behind the ship, and it continuously records zooplankton by kind of rolling it up in a silk kebab of zooplankton. And because we know the time it goes in, we know the time it goes out, we kind of can understand where zooplankton is distributed on a very, very big scale. So that's very helpful. For a bit more deeper, because the CPR only goes kind of like upper 10 meters of the water. If you want to go deeper and understand zooplankton communities deeper than 10 meters, then we need nets. And these work like fishing nets, but they mesh a bit smaller because the animals are a bit smaller. Then we have something new called environmental DNA, and it's basically like humans, animals shed a lot of skin cells here and there, and sometimes when you filter a lot of water from the environment, here, for example, underneath the ice, there's a lot of water, and we filter some of it, and we hope to find these little traces of animals in the water. So that's what we're doing too. And then I use a lot of the data from ocean robotics. I'm not deploying the glider and floats and all fancy technology myself, but I'm lucky to work with a lot of smart people who do that. And for me, that's very important because I want to understand the environment and the changes in the environment and then connect that to the species and the animals I find. So looking at the environment is very important for me. So combining all these methods hopefully helps me to understand the changes in the zooplankton community, especially in the Ross Sea. And of course, there's many others, as I said. There's more than enough methods out there. It's about the integration that is kind of tricky sometimes. Little issues along the way, and I thought I'd show you some fieldwork fails. Here, for example, this is me on the ship, on the Tangaroa in this case, and Mike, the nice crew member, who helped me a lot with deploying my little net here. As you can see, I'm very happy before deployment. However, after the deployment, because you can see maybe there's something missing here, we put the net in, and then we pulled out just the frame because the nets both popped off and are probably now on the bottom of the sea. Unfortunately, I think they were not really, connected well to the frame, or there's something that swam in there or something. But yeah, we got the frames back, and it was a sad day. Thankfully, we always take so many spares when we go to sea, so I had 2 more extra nets and could sample the rest of the voyage, because this was quite early on, and it would be really sad to leave the ship without any data. But then, of course, also it's cold in Antarctica. You kind of forget about it because it sounds really nice, but then also sitting now in a warm room is great, but actually being out there, it takes a long time to dress. For example, dressing up like this with so many different layers, it just takes a long time. And then you sleep in these tents at like minus 30 degrees Celsius. It's not really warm. For example, here, it's hard to see, I think, but it's my tent, the inside of my tent in my first aid kit. And as you can see, there's some snow flakes forming just because my breath during the night was like steaming up and forming these snow crystals. So yeah, there was a cold night. But I mean, it's fun, and it's like, so I feel so privileged to even just do this work. Yeah, it's just amazing. And here, this is my way to brushing my teeth, and I thought I'd show you this as well. So this is behind the containers and the flags there. We have the holes there to put our like toothbrush stuff in. And yeah, you can see there was a bit of a windy day, so blowing snow. But it was, beautiful too, because you can see the sun is out too. So I think I'll show again, because I mean, it's just really, pretty. I took out the sound because it was very loud because of the wind, but you have to like really kneel down and spit in the hole in the ice, because otherwise the toothbrush and mouthwash is kind of flying out in space. So yeah, it's just like random stuff that happens in the field while doing all these other things, trying to figure out how climate change is impacting the ecosystem. And that's it. I probably end with thanking all these people. There's a lot of people involved in bringing us out there and helping me and just being on the ship or in the field with me. And yeah, there are a lot of people and they're all amazing. So thank you to them, because we thanked a lot to like the money and like the funders and logistic, like people make it happen. But those people are actually with us in the field, and we become like a sea ice family and ship family, and it's just great. So thank you so much for inviting me again.
Oh, thank you, Svenja. That was really cool. I guess it really puts into perspective, like your firsthand account puts it into perspective how challenging it actually is to study zooplankton and in the Southern Ocean, and how important it is. And the pteropods are so cute. So
I know. I thought people like it usually because they're so flappy,
They are so cute.
Should I unshare my screen so I can see people actually?
Yeah, I'm gonna launch a really quick poll. And we're just gonna see. Hopefully this comes up for everybody. It's we're wondering, true or false, Antarctic ice is always in motion. Show me your thoughts. And then when I've got a few more answers, I'll give you the answer and we'll move on to our next presentation, and I'll check the Q&A. All right, so it looks like pretty much everyone's answered. It is true. So the force of gravity and its own colossal weight, the ice can be likened to a slow motion river moving from the highest points towards the open ocean. So our next presenter, there's no open questions at the very minute, but put your questions in the Q&A and we'll ask them all at the end. We'll leave plenty of time for that. I'm just going to introduce our next speaker, which is Richard Kinsey. Thank you, Richard. Richard is a senior ranger at the Department of Conservation. Mr. Kinsey specializes in the marine ecology of Fiordland, Te Moana o Atawhenua marine area. And he's going to talk to us about this area and all of his knowledge of the Fiordland marine space. It is over to you now.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Good evening, everybody. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to follow dancing snails, but I will do my best. Hopefully you guys can see my screen okay. Managed to success in the first bit. That's good to know. Cool. Okay.
We can't see it yet.
Try again. We're all good?
Yeah, it's all good.
Right. Okay, so yeah, evening everybody. I'm going to talk to you guys about the Fiordland Te Moana o Atawhenua marine area. A little bit about the marine protection in one of Aotearoa's most unique ecosystems, or range of ecosystems. I guess it's not just one ecosystem, as we'll talk through. We'll talk a little bit about why Fiordland's unique, a little bit about obviously the need for protection and somewhere you might think of as being remote, maybe not quite as remote as the Antarctic, but remote for New Zealand standards nonetheless. A little bit about how the fjords are managed, and I guess it's one of the things that I'd like to sort of really highlight the holistic sort of management for which we've got here, and a little bit of looking into the future, the sort of threats and how potentially I guess how resilient is the ecosystem at the bottom of New Zealand. So I guess just for those of you that may or may not have been down here, Fiordland doesn't just include Milford Sound. There are 14 fjords that range from Milford or Piopiotahi, Milford Sound in the north, all the way down through to Rakatuma Preservation Inlet in the south. And these fjords are quite different. I guess the sort of fjords in Milford are a lot more sort of steep-sided, narrow fjords. As you go further south, you get down into quite wide, sort of flat, open fjords, which are a lot more pelagic. And I guess it sort of highlights the story from Tutareki Whānau, who's the Māori gentleman in the sort of bottom left-hand corner. He was responsible for Māori folklore for creating the fjords. Started down south in Preservation and Chalky Inlet, and as he got better, as he moved sort of further north, he got through to steeper, narrower fjords until he got to Milford Sound, where he sort of perfected his art. So this is, of course, a picture of Milford Sound. Many of you guys may have been. It's one of the sort of more accessible ones to be able to get to. And Milford gets hundreds of thousands of visitors which come every year. A lot of them bus all the way from Queenstown, take a boat, cruise around, have a look at the scenery. But not many people get the chance to be able to actually have a look under the water in the marine environment. And I'm maybe a little bit biased, but I'd like to say it's probably about as spectacular underneath the water as it is above. We've got amazing, unique assemblages of species. So what you're looking at here is a sort of an old black coral tree. It's parts of it are still alive, parts of it dead. Those parts that obviously sort of pass away get captured by a whole bunch of other species. So it's a pretty amazing marine environment. And it's influenced by, influenced hugely by the sort of terrestrial input to the fjords. This is a photo on a nice sunny day. As you can imagine, in the fjords we get a few of them, but this is a particularly nasty day when it's obviously raining pretty hard. But it's the topography and the weather and these sorts of things that really drive the unique ecosystems in the fjords. Milford and those sort of northern fjords get about 7 to 8 meters of rain a year. So when you actually stack that up, it's quite a bit of rain. That something that then drives through the forest. You obviously have all of the rain going through the forest floor, the tannins that get that stay in the water end up on top of this fresh water line. And in those sort of northern fjords, that freshwater land can be really deep. You can get to a stage where it's not uncommon to have 10 to 15 meters of freshwater sitting on top of the seawater. Because of that freshwater layer and the input that's coming into this from the terrestrial environment sort of on the top, that zips back out to sea, and the seawater itself comes into the further sort of underneath the water. And so you get this what's called estuarine circulation. And that's really important. I guess that affects the sort of larval distribution of fish and shellfish and invertebrates, but it's also responsible for this sort of deep sea emergence that you get in the fjords. And these coral species that you find generally in sort of deep water, that larval dispersal allows them to be there in the first place. Then the freshwater layer, that sort of thing, starts to be able to create a lack of light environment, which allows them to grow. And I guess from a fjord perspective, you have real sort of like deep inner fjords, and right up at the top, the heads, they're really terrestrially driven. You can see a couple of the sort of estuaries there from the photographs. Lots and lots of waters input into the sort of tops of these places. And then you have sort of waterfalls and tree avalanches. About the only avalanche that you get in Fiordland is usually a bunch of trees which all sort of hold on to each other. And a lot of these species, things like the pseudocynus and a lot of those sort of invertebrate species, rely almost entirely on the terrestrial input that you get from the fjord. So these inner fjord environments, very, 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 very sort of dark. No kelp really gets to grow. A lot of terrestrial input. A lot of invertebrate species that grow. As you move back out, you kind of go through these sort of zones where you kind of mid-fjord, you kind of get a bit of influence from the sea, you get a little bit of influence from the sort of inner fjords, and then you get out into the Fiordland coast, which is a pretty high energy dynamic environment. There's you're getting back out into lots more light, lots more sort of kelp environment, a lot more wave exposed, and there's a range of different, I guess, sort of habitats that you have in the fjords. I'll flip through a couple of photos just to be able to show you. This is more of a sort of inner fjord environment, not so much in the way of kelp, quite a lot of sediment, which sort of hangs off a lot of the species. Anything that sort of sticks out out of the water column, such as like the black coral you can see here. And as you go through, you get a little bit more influence of sort of kelp up in the sort of top, maybe sort of 10 meters or so. But one of the things, I guess, for these next couple of photos and a little video is just to be able to show how many species there grow in the fjords, and just that everything's growing on top of each other, really colourful, really diverse, lots of bryozoans, basidiums, sponges, and it's just a pretty cool environment. I can show you a really shaky video which hopefully will work, but this just gives an idea of, I guess, the sort of colours that you're getting to see. Lots of little sponges, lots of little basidiums, and lots of little fish swimming around. So it's a pretty cool place to be able to spend some time. And again, dominated by invertebrates rather than by sort of kelp in a lot of places. As we move sort of further out, you're getting towards the sort of more sort of outer coast, or those sort of environments where you get a little bit more of that sort of marine influence. A lot more sort of rock lobster starting to hang out with the kelp and the black coral. When you get the sort of I don't know if Goldilocks zone is kind of the wrong way to put it, but you kind of get these influences from a whole bunch of different things. Again, black coral is probably one of those species which is really well known in Fiordland. There's potentially about 300 colonies that live from sort of Milford all the way down through to preservation, and they can get to about 300 years old, 4 to 5 meters in size. So it's kind of nice to think that when Captain Cook rocked up in 1770 and sort of kind of checked out the fjords, that some of these black coral were still growing underneath the environment, and those guys would have had no idea a lot of them were there. As you get out into the sort of real open coasty parts of the fjords, then obviously we get into the real kelp-dominated species or environment. Mostly Aconia, but you also get a lot of carpophyllums, I guess, and as you get right out to Landsbergia and the same. So there's a lot of really dynamic environments in the fjords. And just a few more photos before we sort of carry on, but this gives you a bit of an idea. I guess a bunch of coral species which are protected under the Wildlife Act. There's a bunch of species which obviously you don't necessarily find at sort of diveable depths, like black corals, one of those species which generally are deep sea species you can see pretty shallow in the fjord. So it's pretty cool. And I guess as sort of Svetlana sort of mentioned that there are a lot of there are a lot of threats that you don't necessarily associate with somewhere like the fjords, you know, the remote part of New Zealand. Surely there's not going to be any problems with things like overfishing or, you know, sort of other things. But the reality of the situation is, I guess, is that there are a bunch of threats in the fjords there, and there have been for a number of years. Some of them sort of changed over time. You know, things like overfishing with lobster and finfish, things like invasive species, pollution, climate change, and I guess climate change and things like that are really starting to sort of come home to roost at the moment. So I guess in the sort of mid to late 1990s and sort of early 2000s, there were a bunch of people that spent time in the fjords who started to realize that you know, things were changing, which something needed to be done. So I'll talk a little bit now about like the management and how actually sort of things have changed over the years with Fiordland. The Fiordland Te Moana Artificial Marine Management Act was brought in 2005, but it started about 10 years before that by some concerned local fishermen, commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, a couple of conservationists who kind of saw that the fjords were changing. You never used to be able to have a problem catching a fish. You never used to have a problem with any of those sorts of things. And you know, those guys started to notice that things were actually starting to degrade and something needed to be done. So they went to the government of the day, who basically said, cool, if you guys want to put something together, we'll have a look at it. So this sort of things, I guess, one of the key things with the Fiordland management is that it was driven by the bottom up. It was driven by a group of guys and a group of people who decided that actually there were a bunch of things that needed to be done. And so from that, they formulated basically this act and the formulation of the Fiordland Marine Guardians, who are basically a legislated group of people who represent different groups, although they represent the Guardians. And they put in a bunch of commercial exclusion zones, reduced bag limits for fishing, created another 8 marine reserves on top of 2 that were already there to be able to create 10, created the little China shops, which are the discrete, fragile pieces of environment, which are obviously sort of really fragile, hence the name China shops, and close some fisheries to be able to just try and get to a stage where obviously the fjords were managed in a more sort of holistic way rather than just sort of locking up marine protected area and nothing else. So this is a map, gives you a bit of an idea of obviously how all that kind of fits together. You have obviously commercial exclusion zones, so there's no commercial fishing inside the fjords anymore. There used to be quite a lot of lobster fishing, blue cod fishing, and sort of finfish industry. And now we have reduced bag limits for recreational fishing and marine reserves, and a whole suite of ways to be able to manage the marine environment. And I guess one of the things that's sort of key is that there are a bunch of marine reserves which hopefully get to a stage where we can see what changes might happen over the next 10, 20, 30 years. But there are also ways of trying to manage other parts of the fjords in a holistic way so that everyone can still enjoy going for a fish, but also there's a bunch of different things that that are managed. So from a DOC perspective, we're in charge of with the Guardians of sort of feeding into like a long-term monitoring program with them. So we've got a bunch of sites across the fjords where we look at things like recreational fish species, we look at lobsters, we look at black coral and habitat, just to see whether or not things have changed over time and to see whether or not obviously things are getting better or getting worse. And so we've done a bunch of different research. What does the data show? It's really hard to be able to tell, I think, with a lot of the work in the fjords. A lot of these places are really lowly productive, and so a lot of the inner fjord sites haven't shown much change. Some of the marine reserves have sort of have little flickers of signs that maybe the fish are starting to sort of get a little bit better. Maybe lobster is starting to come back, but unlike sort of some of the marine reserves sort of further north, I guess Nick will talk a bit about some of those. They show really strong signs of change after marine protected areas have been put in. But the fjords themselves are obviously pretty slow to be able to show those changes. But anecdotally, I think when you go for a swim in some places like the Gut Marine Reserve, which has been around since the sort of mid-90s, you definitely see larger blue cod. You can definitely notice a difference. But I think a lot of the research that we do doesn't necessarily pick that up. So again, I guess looking at the future with regards to that, there are still a bunch of threats that that we have in the fjords and ways of, I guess, how we're going to manage them. Things like obviously fisheries, is really starting to show over the last 5 to 10 years a reduction in things like blue cod, Halfter, and species like that. So with the Guardians and the fish and MPA fisheries have been able to just tweak the rules to be able to see whether or not things come back over time. Lobster are doing pretty well in the fjord, so there are some sort of good news stories. I guess the way that the commercial fishery has managed their own sort of fish stocks, and the fact that the inner fjords are no longer fished too heavily for lobster, they're a really good success story. But there are a bunch of threats and a bunch of things which we're still sort of trying to manage. Some of them, I guess, invasive species. Across the country, there are a suite of different things. We're lucky enough, or unlucky enough, depending on which way you put it, to just have Undaria in Breaksea Sound and Dusky Sound. But I guess that's something that obviously is starting to potentially impact the ecosystems in the fjord. So far, it seems that maybe that top few meters that Undaria is starting to get a bit of a hold. We're still got a program to be able to manage it, but I guess the sort of pristine nature of the sort of kelp and the invertebrate species is hopefully able to sort of keep those species at bay, whilst we can hopefully try and manage them and get rid of them. And things like climate change, I guess, is a real concern from the point of view of, I guess, bleaching sponges. You guys may have seen in the news, up to 3 million cup sponges bleached over the last couple of years with regards to marine heat waves. And these are sorts of things, I guess, that it's really, really hard to be able to manage from a point of view of climate change as a whole. But being able to manage the ecosystem and being able to manage the species that we find in the fjords hopefully makes them as resilient as possible. Be interesting to see what happens over time as these sorts of things start to get more and more prevalent. One of the good news stories, I guess, and one of the things that we're just starting to find out about is things like blue carbon and the fjord's ability to be able to sequester probably up to about a third of New Zealand's carbon within the fjord. So you think about somewhere that only has 14 fjords, some of them are pretty small. There's some work being done at the moment which hopefully shows that the fjords are a really important place for being able to actually manage some of our sort of climate change questions and being able to actually change things in the future. So this is kind of exciting. And I guess just to finish, there's so many questions that we need to know, so much more to understand for just a little tiny piece of New Zealand. But we don't necessarily know how resilient the fjords are to things like climate change. We don't necessarily know how best to be able to manage that side of things. But I guess the sort of one key takeaway for me is just to be able to the fact that we've got a management regime in place, which is tested by the sort of group like the Fiordland Marine Guardians, brings all of the agencies together to be able to have those conversations about marine protection. Hopefully, it stands us in good stead for the future. But I guess one little plug: if anyone's out there and they want to come and do some work in the fjords, then there's plenty of things to find out about. But I think that is me. So any questions? Then please feel free to sing along.
Kia ora, thank you. That was fantastic, and there is some already great questions that are coming up. I'll launch this poll really quickly, and then we're going to get right into a couple questions. So, we've got a true or false? Hopefully, everybody can see that. In Fiordland, black corals are only found in deep water. True or false? And then we've got some great questions coming in. So if you can put them in the Q&A, that would be awesome. Some more. All right, we're gonna close this poll, and it looks like false. So you guys, in Fiordland, there are some species that can occur really shallow, from 10 meters depth, and I know that Richard can vouch for that. And there is. That actually leads really well into the question that we've got from Carlene. So Carlene says, Richard, how deep do you dive in Fiordland to see the corals, and what temperature is the water when you are diving?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it depends upon where you are, but a lot of the coral can be found, especially on some of those sort of overhanging bits, as shallow as 4 or 5 meters. You can find small black coral trees, and they ranged right the way down through some of the deep sort of rough work that we've done, 120, 130 meters, and deeper. Obviously, you start to find them too. But I think kind of that sort of maybe sort of 30 to 40 meters is where you start to get those sort of they sort of black coral gets sort of dominated by sort of that kind of depth, I guess. Water temperature is a good question. Like, it's actually a lot warmer than you would think. Diving in the fjords is probably warmer than when you get over to places like Dunedin. But the wintertime right now, probably the water's maybe 10 to 11 degrees. Rarely drops into single figures. It's usually 10 or 11 degrees. And then so I guess it's one of the only positives about things like marine heat waves. And in sort of February last year, when we were doing our monitoring work, the water temperature was up to about 20, 21 degrees. So it varies quite a lot. That sort of summer sort of coastal current comes down can be really warm. So it does range pretty well.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. We've got some more questions in there, but we'll ask those to you later. Thank you for that. I am going to introduce our third and final speaker now, which is Dr. Nick Shears. His research focuses primarily on the impact of humans on rocky reef ecosystems. A large part of his recent research includes examining the role of marine protection and restoration in allowing kelp forests to regenerate and their associated marine life to return and flourish. Over to you, Nick. Oops.
Thanks, Sarah. Can you see my screen?
Looks good.
Right, kia ora koutou. Thanks everybody for tuning in. So yeah, we're heading further north up to warmer waters, and yeah, most of my research focuses on rocky reefs in the North Island, but we're in the northeastern part of the North Island, but also a little bit in the Marlborough Sounds, so a little bit down in the South Island. Sorry, here we go. After the previous talks, I thought I should just put in a photo of me in my happy place doing research at the Pornites Islands, where it's quite balmy, probably 22, 23 degrees in the summer. So my research is focused on rocky reef ecosystems, trying to understand these ecosystems, how humans impact them, and how we can better restore, manage, and conserve these ecosystems in the future. So we are a temperate nation, which means that in general, our shallow rocky reefs are dominated by large seaweeds or kelps, so kelp forests. And these reef environments are hugely important for humans. They provide heaps of ecosystem services. Lots of the species we like to eat obviously live on rocky reefs. Things like crayfish and snapper. And these reefs also provide a range of other ecosystem services that are important. They provide food and habitat for lots of species. And also we're increasingly sort of understanding the importance of these habitats in terms of fixing carbon, storing carbon, as a source of blue carbon. But unfortunately, kelp forests globally are in decline, and actually at rates that are faster than declines in coral reefs. So just in Aotearoa, one of our major causes of kelp forest loss is actually fishing. And this is the case in many temperate regions, and that occurs through the overfishing of top predators on rocky reefs. So within a healthy reef ecosystem, we have lots of predators such as crayfish, spiny lobster, or large predatory fish. But due to historic and long-term fishing of these species, in many cases, we've had this shift to what we call an urchin barren. So sea urchins, or in our case, kinna, have become abundant in many areas and actually graze down the kelp forest. And so that means a lot of those services that these reefs provide are then lost. But just as an example of these kinnibarrens, they generally occur in the outer part of the Hauraki Gulf. This is the Hauraki Gulf on the shores of Auckland. And the kinnibarrens generally occur in the clearer, cleaner outer parts of the Hauraki Gulf. So if we zoom in here on Hauturu Atoi, Little Barrier Island, which is one of our prime conservation islands, on the land, the surrounding reefs have fairly in not great shape, with about nearly half of the shallow reefs deforested by kinna. So we just zoom in on this area. You can see these kinnibarrens from space, basically from satellite images. So that's this band of reef here. And if we actually look back in time, these barrens occurred in the 70s, but in the 50s, those reefs were largely dominated by seaweed. So all the early descriptions of reefs around Aotearoa describe these diverse seaweed forests and kelp effectively extending down as far as the eye could see. But obviously that's changed. With fishing, we've had this increase in urchins. So how do we reverse this? And this is where marine protection has been shown to be very effective. So this is New Zealand's first marine reserve, which was established in 1977. It's where we have our marine lab, which is where University of Auckland's Marine Lab, where I'm based. And it was actually set up for scientific purposes. But through monitoring the changes in this reserve over time, we've learned a lot about the effects of fishing and how we can reverse those effects through protection. So this is Goat Island, right in the middle of the reserve there, in the 70s. So just an aerial image. And about 40% of the reef within the marine reserve when it was first established was urchin barren. And that followed years of fishing, and crayfish numbers and snapper numbers were relatively low in the reserve at this time, and they were small. So over time, the predators increased, the snapper and the crayfish, they got bigger, and slowly the kinna sea urchin numbers declined, and we had this switch back to the kelp forest. And so this has been well documented and quite well, publicized. The changes took about 20 to 30 years. But as far as marine protection goes, we're in a fairly uncertain future, and we can't really ignore the fact that there's a number of other stresses happening on the marine environment and changes that are happening, in front of our eyes, such as what we've just heard about in Fiordland with the sponges. We saw similar impacts on sponges up in the Hauraki Gulf in 2022. And this is some of the long-term temperature data from the Lee Marine Lab, ocean temperature, and you can see 2022 was the warmest year by quite some way. And then if we look at the rainfall recorded at the Marine Lab, 2023 was then the wettest year on record. So we have these really unprecedented events that are happening. So how can marine protection help with this? We have all these impacts. Really, is marine protection, how effective is it, and how can it help us in terms of managing the impacts in the marine environment? So marine protected areas are very simple. You just take an area of coast and you stop certain activities, generally fishing, which then allows those areas to recover from any impact that fishing might have had on the species or ecosystems. But I guess one of the big questions is whether those marine protected areas can also increase the resilience to other stresses that are happening in the marine environment. So what I want to just talk to you about is some of the long-term monitoring work that we've been doing in different marine reserves that's providing important insights into the changes that we're seeing on the reefs and the role that marine protection can play in our management of our reef ecosystems. So the first one I want to talk about is the status of crayfish or kura in the marine environment in the Hauraki Gulf. So it's been highly publicized that crayfish are functionally extinct. Populations have been, are at really low levels. But in 2018, there was a huge reduction in the commercial quota, and in 2019, a subsequent reduction in the recreational catch as part of a plan to rebuild the stocks. And based on the fisheries results coming in, it seems like things are getting better. So we've been doing surveys throughout the Hauraki Gulf, including inside and outside protected areas. And we did this in 2021 and 22. And then part of my group are actually out at Halfter, Great Barrier Island tonight, finishing off the final surveys this year. So we'll have some really up-to-date information on the state of crayfish populations. So these are dive surveys. We swim along transects and count the number of crayfish and along the transect and estimate their sizes. And we also have been doing this in marine reserves for a long period of time, so we can see how they've been changing over time. And unfortunately, what we're finding is that it hasn't been a lot of recovery since the quota cuts in 2018. Here's a plot showing you the number of legal numbers of crayfish in reserves in the green compared to the fished areas we've been sampling. You can see that there's much higher densities of legal sized lobster. And if we actually look at it, the biomass in the fished areas is less than 10% of what we're finding in the reserves. So it's over 10 times higher in the reserves than in the fished areas. And this is quite different to what we're hearing in terms of the fishery. But at least it's showing that these reserves are being effective at protecting some of the adult populations. This is some long-term data from the Tawhanui Marine Reserve, which is just near the Lee Reserve, that's been collected by Roger Grace since the 1978. And I started doing these surveys under his guidance in about 5 years ago. And since he's passed away, I've managed to keep getting them going with a bit of help from Sarah, actually. Thank you. But the thing that we can see here is that the numbers in the reserve increased through time. This is legal in the green. But over the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen this downward trend, both in the number of adult or legal lobster, as well as in the juveniles. So it's showing the reserves being, densities are much higher, but also that there's these recent trends that are quite concerning. So we think this is due to low recruitment. Initially thought it was due to kind of the size of the reserve and fishing on the boundary. But I think it's also been exacerbated by low recruitment, which is likely related to this warming trend that we're seeing, or else the small population size likely throughout the whole northeastern coast. So it's not a great news story as far as protected area goes on one level, but on the other, it's really showing that we need wider protection measures, not just relying on a few small reserves. So if we just heard about the Fiordland example, where there was extensive closures to commercial fishing, large scale closures, and then implementation of protected areas, it shows that we could really potentially reverse some of these trends and hopefully increase the resilience of these populations to any impacts that might be happening, such as due to warming. So that's one story. Sarah, you might have to start tell me how many minutes I've got left.
You can carry on, go for it. No, you're going all right.
I thought this example is a bit closer to home, especially close to Merck, the Long Bay Marine Reserve. It's, I guess, an interesting one because it's in an urban environment. It has a huge estuary going into it. There's been a lot of coastal development and therefore a lot of sediment. And the sediment going into Long Bay has had a lot of attention, and it really questions the value of marine protected areas in some of these environments. So in March last year, DOC carried out a baited underwater video survey for snapper And as a class, just this week, for one of my classes just this week, we've had them analyze the data. So here's some data that's hot off the press. So baited underwater video surveys involve lowering a bait down in this orange container here and filming it for half an hour, and you record what fish come in. You can actually just make out some snapper in that image, and you can estimate how big they are based on, hopefully you can, based on the markings on the frame, how big the snapper are. Basically, a legal size snapper is about the size of the orange bait pot. The top image is the video with the most fish outside the reserve, and the bottom image is the video with the most fish inside the reserve. But what we found from these initial analysis is that the number of snapper in this reserve, in the videos, was about 10 times higher. Sorry, number of legal snapper. So, and they were also much larger in the reserve compared to the fished area. So it's not surprising, but it's really encouraging in terms of a place like Long Bay, where generally says, oh, well, there's so much sediment, there's so many other impacts. It's not a, so it really shows that even protecting areas in the inner Gulf can provide a really good refuge for species like snapper, which are so heavily targeted. And importantly, it's protecting those big snapper, right? So this is, I'm not sure how well this will play on Zoom, I'm sorry, but this is of some big snapper in Tawharanui Marine Reserve scoffing down some kinna, and effectively the way they eat kinna is they sort of jam the whole thing in their mouth and then just squash it. So yeah, obviously protecting these big kinna in protected areas is really important from the perspective of controlling kinna populations and barrens. And so that's really what we've seen in the Lee Reserve and Tawharanui reserves. And so, do marine protected areas increase resilience to kelp forests? And that's a really tricky question, and the answer is it depends. And so I'm going to give you two examples because it depends on the context in which we're referring to the resilience. So in the Lee Marine Reserve, the answer has been yes. So within the reserve, over time, we've had this effectively succession of the urchin barrens, from an urchin barren through to a kelp forest. And once the kelp forest has been established in the reserve, it's been very stable, and it's still there now. Whereas in the case of the fished areas outside the reserve, these areas tend to fluctuate. They're kinna barrens for a lot of the time. They might go to kelp algal turfs periodically, or sometimes even in some cases, they might flip back to a kelp forest and then back to a barren. So we're seeing a lot more variability in the fished areas compared to the reserves, where you've got a more stable, healthy ecosystem. So the not so good story is in one of our most famous marine reserves at the Poor Knights, where we aren't seeing resilience to some of these long-term changes or wider effects. So at the Poor Knights, which was fully protected in 1998, there's been a huge increase in snapper. It's been really effective at protecting fish populations. It's amazing, right? It's incredible. So it's actually not saying that the Poor Knights isn't working. And with an increase in snapper, we've seen a decline in kinna barrens. So the number of kinna have declined at the Poor Knights, but with warming temperatures and likely a lack of large predators like crayfish, we've seen an increase in this particular sea urchin, Centris stephanus rogersi. So it's a subtropical, more warm water species of urchin that's always been at the Poor Knights, but generally in low numbers. And so here's a large snapper. I'm not sure how well this is playing, but there's large snapper there, and they don't seem to eat them. They're quite happy to eat the kinna, but these Centris stephanus are just hiding in the cracks. They come out at night, and they're really starting to cause a problem at the Poor Knights. And one of the main predators of Centra stephanus, this urchin, is crayfish. And we don't know exactly why, but there's not a lot of crayfish at the poor nights. So we're not seeing a lot of predation on these Centra stephanus. Right, so just to finish up, do MPAs increase the resilience of kelp forests or our rocky reef ecosystems? I think, yes, definitely for our target, those important species. Like crayfish, if we have concerns around long-term warming and the impacts on the crayfish populations, then having them protected in MPAs is a really good idea to help increase the resilience of those populations. But as we've seen for the reef ecosystems as a whole, and in some cases it might play, the MPAs might be effective, but in other cases they won't. And this really highlights some of the challenges around management of the marine environment, and how other stresses such as large-scale overfishing, sedimentation, warming may impact recovery in different ways. So what we need is a more holistic approach to management. So we do need marine protected areas as part of it, like we've seen in Fiordland, but that was combined. The Fiordland crayfish story was also combined with better management of the fishery, the large-scale closures, as well as marine protected areas. And there's also a case for then using active restoration where necessary to help accelerate recovery. And I think that for those of you who are not aware of this, there's currently a bill sitting before Parliament, just waiting for the final sign-off, which would be looking to increase the level of protection in the Hauraki Gulf. There's 12 new high protection areas proposed, which are a bit like marine reserves, and a range of other measures. So it's at least a start towards some of this more integrative or holistic management, and a step towards achieving a high level of protection in the Hauraki Gulf. So I'll leave it there, and I just hopefully one day we'll see more of these guys cruising around out in the open. Got it.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Yeah, that is hopefully a step happening in the right direction, and thanks for putting all that in. It all together. It's really good to hear that Long Bay's actually got 10 times as much snapper biomass. So we've got a quick poll that's going to be launched, and then we're going to get we've got a question for you that'll help us lead into it. But since we were talking about snapper, I got this one. Let's see. On your screen, you guys should see something fishy. True or false? All snapper begin life as females. True or false? And let's see. We've talked a lot about snapper, but in this last little bit, let's see. Well, it's looking 50-50 at the moment. Got a lot of people that are. It's almost a tie. All right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ending poll. And you guys, good work. Just squeaked out the true wins. The correct answer is true. During their 3rd and 4th years of life, about half of them change sex, going through a hermaphroditic stage to become males. By the time that they mature, the population consists of about half males and half females. So we're going to move on from that into a question about actually about marine pests and resilience of the marine ecosystem. So Nick, this one I think you'd be better placed to answer. Do you know if there's any data on the prevalence of marine pests within marine protected areas as opposed to outside them?
Is there any data? I don't know about whether there's data, whether there's any data on it. And there's, again, it's a kind of context dependent in terms of some pests. If we've got a healthy ecosystem, theoretically, it's going to be more resilient to invasive species coming in. Or at least if they come in, they're going to have less of an impact. There isn't a lot of, in theory, that should be the case, but I'd say there isn't a lot of evidence for it.
Yeah, thanks for that though. I'm gonna give you that. Well, there's one more that I think I'll pass off to Svenja and give you a second to type an answer out to Peter. Carlene's asking, Svenja, can you please share some of your research results from Antarctica?
Hard to say, because I only started studying the Ross Sea probably 2 years ago when I moved over to New Zealand. My current work is kind of focusing on forming baselines, so we kind of collecting a lot of data and comparing it to earlier data, and collating all the zooplankton data, because surprisingly, there's not too much out there. We know a lot more about benthic ecosystems in certain areas in the Ross Sea than about zooplankton in general. Another problem is because it's ice covered, it's hard to access, so we don't really know how they're actually distributed. So a lot of my work right now is looking at just collecting data, understanding what the community composition is like, so what kind of species are dominant, how many are there, and then because without these baselines, we don't know what the change will be in the future, right? So if whether the water gets warmer, how would it change? But we don't know what to compare to. We don't have this baseline data. So yeah, long story short, I don't have that many results yet from the Ross Sea. What I do have is the continuous plankton recorder. Is a time series, and we have now 15 years of data. It's quite a long time series for the Southern Ocean, at least. And what we do see, not in terms of zooplankton, but in terms of plastics, we see an increase in plastics in the Southern Ocean in general, in the sector below New Zealand, between New Zealand and the Ross Sea particularly. And that's a lot of like fibers, and these fibers are kind of, so usually they're colorful, right? They're coming from clothing and nets and everything, but we see a lot of bleached fibers, so like very transparent. That means that they're probably in the ecosystem or in the water for a long time, because UV radiation and waves kind of rubbing off the colors. So what we see and especially the last, let's say, 6 to 7 years, there's an increase in the time series of plastics in the Southern Ocean, and it's definitely something that we have to investigate where that comes from, and if it kind of enters the Ross Sea, for example, or where the kind of the hotspots are. Yeah, that's the next step, but we see an increase, and that's a bit concerning, I think.
Yeah, but also so important to have a baseline. So
totally, yeah, but it's a slow process.
Yeah,
and I think also it's like finding also methods, I guess, to capture all the different diversity, because the like traditional methods are not doing a quite good job for all the different species. So, for example, for like fragile, like jellyfish that fall apart in the nets, so we have to find another methods to study those. So I'm kind of trying to figure out, looking at old data, but also collecting new data with different methods to understand how the diversity is changing in general.
Awesome, thank you. I'm gonna pass over a question to Mr. Kinsey from Patrick. He's wondering, with the changing climate, is Fiordland expected to see more or less rainfall? And would that change the light conditions needed for the black coral and other deep sea species living there?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Patrick. Like, I think the west coast and the South Island is supposed to get wet, so I think we get into a stage where we are in theory going to see more rainfall. But I guess one of the things that that's maybe more important from a fjord perspective is the way with which we maybe get our weather, and it's probably the same across the country, I guess. That sort of change in climate is starting to have more kind of extreme weather events rather than your kind of sort of standard rainfall. So we're starting to see that on the coast, I guess, sort of higher wind speeds and sort of bigger storms, or bigger patches of sort of kind of stable weather. So I think it's like that there will in theory be more rainfall, and I think that could have the potential to sort of tweak where sort of species might be able to survive. But I think probably a greater concern is the sort of changes to climate with those extreme events, and both good and bad. Like, I think you certainly in the last sort of 10 years or so, you started to see more, sort of big storms, big rainfall events, or more sort of periods of sort of really settled weather. And I think often when, Auckland and sort of like the north of the North Islands having those sort of, really big kind of sort of rain events, we're sort of tucked down in the south. Actually, we sort of get away with stuff. But yeah, like I guess potentially that could change things in some of the sort of like sort of thinner fjords where fresh water could get deeper. But I guess with those more extreme events or sort of the bigger storms, you get sort of more mixing out from the coast. So it's sort of, I guess, sort of almost 50-50 in some ways.
Thank you. Yeah, it's, I guess, extreme weather is definitely a concern for most marine ecosystems and humans. So yeah, thinking that it will have an impact. Thank you for explaining that. There's so many thank yous in the chat. And I wanted to, before we answered one or two more questions, I wanted to thank everybody for tuning in, and also let them know about the resources tab before you leave the webinar. If you might want to explore some of those links that are in the resources tab on the bottom. All of those links are going to be in a little bit more of a tidy format on our blog page or news page, which we'll send out in an email following sometime tomorrow with a link to the recording. And it looks like there's just maybe one more. We'll take one or two more questions and then maybe wrap up. So Patrick's wondering for you, Svenja, sorry. Patrick's wondering, in the Ross Sea, did you see any illegal fishing taking place?
Fortunately not. There was one time we saw a longline vessel within the marine protected area boundaries, but then we double checked, and actually one of our colleagues was there as an observer, so they had a special permit, so it was not illegal. They had a permit to do that. And I mean, the marine protected area it's a good thing in general because it reduces that. But of course, there's still people need to do some research, including us, because if we're not allowed to go in there, we don't know what's actually happening in there. And the marine protected area kind of creates this, because there's less fishing in there, it creates this like natural laboratory to study climate change impacts, because we can really focus on those and of course other things like plastic pollution. But because there's no fishing, we kind of we have this like environment, we can look at climate change impacts instead of combined effects of all of the activity. So long story short, no, which is good. And I mean, around the Southern Ocean, so there's this fishery organization called, it's like a conservation organization, CAMLA, and New Zealand has a representative there, and all the other countries, and they actually have this information public. So if they get reports of illegal fishing, they put it on their website and really name and shame the countries and also the fishing vessels. So yeah, but there hasn't really been much around, which is good.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's been, I think, one of the things that we see here also. I know we realize the challenge of not policing, but of keeping tabs on marine reserve offenders or marine protected areas or illegal fishing activity and stuff. And it's hard no matter where in the world it happens, but what a challenge it would be for the Ross Sea. So we've got, I think we've managed to answer most questions. I did see one that was kind of questioning a little bit about the percentage of MPAs in New Zealand and across the world. If you do look in the resources tab, there is something called the 30 by 30 progress tracker. Now, all of those technologies that are tracking MPA progress are at different stages, because MPAs are defined in different ways. You've got so many different types. You've got benthic or seafloor protection areas. You've got type 1 and type 2 marine reserves or high protection areas. So these trackers, you've got to be wary when you look at them. You have to look into what kind of filters and the data that is within it. So I would say, if you're really interested in seeing what kind of marine protection is out there, dive into either the 30 by 30 progress tracker, which is by SkyTruth. That's pretty new. That's in the resources tab right now. And there's some other ones, one called Protected Planet as well. But it is just good to kind of think of the marine protection MPA, marine protected area, as a really big blanket term for many different marine protection management practices, strategies.
The MPA Atlas has a good sort of analysis of it all, and it just counts, you know, fully protected or highly protected areas. I checked out where we were on that, and we're about 30th in the world, I think, with less than 1%.
Yeah. But so I do see that in the chat we've got more thanks, and also please, if before you, well, when we end the webinar, or when you leave, you'll see there's a survey. If there's anything that you're really particularly interested in knowing and you want to email us, you can flick us an email about it, and we can see if we can get those questions answered and shared around. Well, it does look like we've answered all the questions and had a great chat. So we might wind things up. I did want to just think my last little thing was about to thank tonight's speakers again. It's great having researchers that we can kind of call on to share their expertise, and then we can try and hopefully communicate this research with a bit wider of an audience. And it's not going to stop with just the webinar. We'll try and create some content that's going to help this message get across to more people. If you're interested in previous webinars that Seaweek has organized, they all have been recorded and they're available to watch on the Seaweek YouTube channel, which is in that resources tab. And this one will be uploaded tomorrow morning, and we'll send it out shortly. For details of future Seaweek events, both virtual and in person, subscribe to our mailing list. We send out monthly updates to let you know what's coming up. And to close, I'd like to offer this whakatoki that we have at Merck. I'm going to give it my best. Is kia whakanonga tangaroa I tu whakamanua. Let the ocean excite your heartbeat. And thank you so much for your company. And ata marie. Good night.
Thanks, Sarah.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Bye.